Um, I'm not pretending to offer anything new. These are ideas that have also been circulating around, but I'm just giving, I think the most I'm doing at times is giving kind of different rationales and different explanations. So you'll see I'll present something called total liberation, and it's, for those of you who are familiar with intersectionality, it should come as no surprise to you, but I'm just, the difference, or why I think I'm being different, is just basing its power, its force on the idea of hypocrisy and trying to not let any kind of transformation gains be hijacked by charges of hypocrisy. In the abstract, it says, I am going to, at least my journey towards engaging with these issues was through the concept of alienation. Alienation is a key concept in social philosophy, whereby we try and understand the social pathologies that hamper people's abilities towards individual self-realization. And I call this a liberal account of alienation. This is not an attempt to force liberalism down your throat. I call it a liberal account of alienation because of the kinds of values it emphasizes. Values such as the centrality of individual autonomy, and what it means to be a person is to realize this individual autonomy. And alienation is a pathology that subsequently hampers your ability to realize yourself as an individual human being. Okay, so as a free human being. So we are looking at the crisis of freedom in terms of the experiences of students in an education system. Okay, I'm basing this off of 3 authors. They're all white. I'm sorry. Well, they're not all white. One's considered white, Achille Mbembe. So,
this is on tape.
he probably knows it. So this is Yegi Rahel. Yegi Rahel provides me with the conceptual account of alienation that I'm going to provide here. Hegel offers me 2 concepts that allow me to further flesh out Yegi's account of alienation, but also allows me to critique some of the practices that student movements like RMF have been engaged with. And then Bembe, I'm also thinking through his critique of Rhodspear's fall as a more psychic state than a political project, and his complaints about the fusion of self and pain and the tragedy of narcissism that he seems to think it falls into. Okay, so the definition of alienation that we're working with is alienation is not the absence of a relation. Alienation is itself a type of relation. It is a deficient relation. It is a relation of relationlessness. Okay, so there are, on a simplistic level, there are sound ways in which we can relate to others and the world we find ourselves in. And there are deficient ways in which we can relate to ourselves and the world and others we encounter. Now, this is where Hegel comes in. Now, the account that Hegel gives us is a very epistemological one, but it's still relevant here. So, there is something it means to know the world, but it's also important that I don't lose myself in an objective account of knowing the world. I must be able to see myself knowing the world. Therefore, an unalienated relationship for Hegel, using Yegi's language, is one where I can see myself, I can see myself knowing the world. So there's a relationship between my objective existence and my subjective existence. What do these 2 concepts mean? Well, you have to recognize, or you have to square the fact that you are an object, in as much as you you have a determinate existence, in as much as you follow laws of nature like any other objects. You are just like the stone. If I throw you off the cliff, you, like that stone, will fall. So you follow laws of nature. At the same time, what is different from how you are different from a stone is that you have a subjective existence. You have a capacity for freedom. In other words, you can represent those laws to yourself. So everyone has a determined existence in terms of I have to eat, but we can choose to represent those laws to ourselves and structure those experiences. So I tell myself I can have breakfast, lunch, and supper. These are not principles you find in nature. That is me representing the laws of nature to myself, and so that is an account of self-determination in which I determine the laws that determine me. Okay, so a perfect, an unalienated relationship is where there is a balance between an objective existence and a subjective existence. And ultimately, you will see me making the claim that Rhodes' most, or at least the complaint that the transformation agenda raises, is that the subjective existence of black students is not recognized. They find themselves subject to a determinate existence. They are treated fundamentally as objects, and as such they are alienated from themselves, and they confront the world as alien to them because it only emphasizes this determinate existence. And subsequently they are self-alienated, alienated from others, and alienated from the world. So part of the transformation agenda is to reclaim a subjective existence, is to assert one's subjectivity. Okay. So, how do I proceed to give this account of alienation? Well, there's usually two ways in which alienation in the literature is often asserted. Well, the key one is there's an appeals to essentialism. So there's some sort of unchanging essence, what it means to be a human being, some sort of standards of authenticity that you have departed from. The problem with essences is that you can't seem to make them universal. You can't say that you can't defend the same essence for everybody. People are not always going to subscribe to whatever account of essence that you provide. And Yegi is keen to depart from this idea of essence. So what is the framework within which you can ground a particular relationship as unalienated? Well, the reason for seeing alienation as a kind of relation is because the self is socially constituted within relationships in society. And part of what it means to not ground authenticity as a sort of essential substance is to say that authenticity is a way of actively relating in the world and with others. So how we now observe alienation is to go to the sites where the self is formed, the kinds of relationships where the sites of these relationships where the self is formed. And the particular site that I'm interested in is the role of a student. So, what it means to be unalienated for Yegi is to have undisturbed relations of appropriation. Again, this is where it's a liberal account, the word appropriation. So for something to not be foreign to you, you must make it your own. And of course, this is an idea that you can disagree with. But for Yegi, there must be a sense in which you're able to see yourself in the world. That's the only way in which you can make the world not foreign to you. That's the only way in which you can make the world not alien to you. And so part of that process of being able to see yourself in the world, is to take ownership of the world, is to appropriate it. And you can do this within your role. And part of what also it means to not be alienated in your role as a student is to be able to make that role your own, right? This presupposes a level of agency, and we're going to see that this agency is otherwise denied to black students. They cannot make their role their own because they cannot relate to the role, because the role operates within a context whereby their being, their subjective existence is not valued, black bodies are not valued. The legacy of institutional racism is a force actively working against black students that prevents the role of being a student from having the promise and possibilities that it otherwise should. So, an alienated relationship is where relations of appropriation are disturbed. And the claim that's been made, at least my interpretation of what student transformation claims are making, is that it is relations of appropriation within the role of a student are disturbed by a legacy of institutional racism. Okay. It is important to recognize that I'm not saying that you're alienated by your role as a student. It's not the role of a student that's alienating you. You're alienated within a role. When you find yourself constrained within the role of a student, where the role of a student no longer holds for you the promise and possibilities that it otherwise, at least that you otherwise expected it to have. Okay. So therefore the question becomes, why are black students making the claim that they are alienated? If they are, at least I'm understanding them to be making a claim about alienation. Rhodes Must Fall has described itself as campaigning through direct action against the reality of institutional racism at the University of Cape Town and in South Africa more generally. And of course, the name of the group does not exhaust the agenda that it's calling for. It's just symbolic, and it represents a systematic charge against white supremacy and privilege on campuses and in South Africa. Initially, at least conceptually, the movement was arguing for transformation. And it said subsequently that, well, it's moved beyond that to decolonization because transformation has been captured by the vestiges of neoliberalism and only articulates surface level change. To really get at the heart of the issue, we have to attack the processes through which not just black bodies, but African countries were integrated into a global economy, and that is colonialism. And so true kind of liberation would involve the decolonization of the university and South Africa. That is the ultimate cure for alienation. So remember I introduced the concept of alienation as having kind of social function. It's used to diagnose pathologies in society. So if we look at it from the lens of a medical analogy, we've seen the sickness of society as alienation, and at least Rhodes Must Fall is engaging with this social reality by offering decolonization as a cure. So, what does it mean to say that, what does it mean to talk about the experience of alienation? Well, there are forces emphasizing the objective existence of black students. So when you walk around, for example, and you see the Rhodes statue, you're reminded of a historical legacy that did not value black people. At least the way in which this legacy interacted with black people was to emphasize them as objects, there to be used as instruments for the advancement of global capital. Similarly, a key characteristic of alienation, like a key buzzword, like whenever you want to, if you're looking at a book and someone's trying to describe the phenomenon of alienation, you would normally see that there is the inability to relate to oneself. So in this particular case, one's role becomes abstract, and it's not possible to relate. And subsequently, there is a disengagement and a lack of identification with this role. So how do we see this manifest in the experiences of black students? Well, one claim they make is that at least one claim that the movement has articulated is that the syllabus on campus is very Eurocentric. It systematically marginalizes and underrepresents knowledge produced by the other. Similarly, there is underrepresentation of black bodies. This makes one's role difficult. It makes it difficult to relate to one's role. So this underrepresentation of black people in the academic staff, as well as the ideas and values that are esteemed within the curriculum, make it difficult to relate to the role of a student, and ultimately you find that students are disillusioned, and often the response is to be disengaged with what they're studying. They don't identify with it. So I mean, I just have a couple of there's a couple of quotes by from the RMF website by some members explaining this charges. But what I see from all this is that the formative nature of roles are supposed to be, so roles like students are supposed to be possibilities for expression and action. However, Rhodes Must Fall laments that black students often find themselves performing their roles within rigidified forms of expression, often in reference to neoliberal epistemologies where they're expected to conform. This rigidity stifles appropriation, meaning that the possibilities for shaping and reshaping one's role as a student is constrained. Subsequently, for RMF, decolonization entails the Africanization of the university, both in its representation and curriculum, because many African students struggle to connect university teaching to their own reality. And the last part is attributed to a student in the movement. So that's for me how I have processed. I learned this thing, I learned about alienation in class, I learned about these theories, and this is for me how I was able to process what I was seeing around me. What I was seeing around me was caused by alienation, and I understood alienation in a particular way. Now, how did I think through some of the criticisms that were levied against Rhodes Must Fall? Okay. The first one that I think about is the claims around decolonizing the curriculum. Now, I have a quote here that says that a student is basically saying that they don't have black lecturers who would otherwise channel the politics of being black in their lectures. And for me, maybe I'm misrepresenting the quote, but for me this seemed like a pattern of engaging in response to alienation. You're doing the exact opposite. So remember, part of the struggle, part of the problem with revolutions and even agendas of social transformation is the extent to which we reproduce the very thing we're fighting against. And I thought that this was at play, particularly because you're emerging from the complaint of alienation, reifying the other, abstracting the other, but you yourself proceed to do that. How does this quote manifest that? Well, it seems to suggest that there's a universal experience of being black. And this experience is recognizable. Furthermore, it seems to suggest that all it takes for one to communicate this experience is a black lecturer. Do all black lecturers subscribe to the politics of being black that you're talking about? Is it the case that all black lecturers have lived this experience? Is it the case that all black students can identify with this experience of being black? And this was a point that I could particularly resonate with myself. I mean, there's reasons why I thought of myself as someone who did not necessarily need a black lecturer to communicate these kinds of messages to me. And there's possible reasons for that. Perhaps it's because I'm a middle class individual, and so my class has kind of acted as a buffer. My class has prevented me from having the kinds of experiences that would otherwise necessitate that I have a black lecturer communicating to me this supposedly universal experiences of being black. So, and so that's the first critical kind of engagement that I had, that there's a kind of dialectic going on. You're reproducing the very things that you're fighting against. So you challenge racial reification with racial reification of your own. But there is hope, I think. It's a minimal kind of hope. But the thing is that when you are reified, when you abstract it, when possibilities are limited for you, when possibilities are limited for me by virtue of this example, I all of a sudden realize that I am the sort of person that has open to him a range of possibilities. I recognize that I am not restricted to these labels. I'm not restricted to these experiences. So it's in confronting that alienation. It's because I myself feel alienated. Why I can't relate to the experiences of black that you're talking about, but I still consider myself black. But it is in confronting that alienation that I realize that I am not the sort of person that can be limited in terms of the range of possibilities that I am and can be. So it is, and this is a key claim that I want to advance, that alienation has a negative and a positive component. Alienation is a struggle, but it is struggle that is the making of consciousness. Inasmuch as alienation entails processes of self-loss, it also presents the individual with an opportunity for self-discovery. And for those of you who participated, I can ask you the question, are you the same person after that? Have you discovered something about it? Do you consider yourself as having forged a new you? And to the extent that you have, then you were presented with an opportunity for self-discovery, despite the experiences of self-loss that were entailed in the experiences of alienation. And I think it's important to recognize the positive aspect of alienation, because what it does is force us to alter our understandings of ourselves, others, and the world. But we can do this in problematic ways. And so the next question that I ask in the second part of this paper is, how should we change our understanding of ourselves and others based on the experience of alienation? Okay. One of the another criticism that I encountered was from Achille Mbembe, who says that Rhodes Must Fall is consumed by a rhetoric of black pain, and that psychic bonds, in particular the bonds of pain and suffering, more than lived material contradictions, are becoming the real stuff of political intersubjectivity. I am my pain. How many times have I heard this statement in the months since Rhodes Must Fall emerged? I am my suffering. And this subjective experience is so incommensurable that unless you have gone through the same trial, you will never understand my condition. The fusion of self and suffering is in this astonishing age of solipsism and narcissism. Well, first of all, if you're familiar with revolutionary literature, this is seems to be an appeal to claims made by Fanon in Black Skins, White Mass. But we're not going to focus on that. It's very unclear why Mbembe sees the fusion of self and suffering as anchored in narcissism. There's other possible explanations for it. As one offered by Nomolanga Kize is that this is a tradition of the humanities that has been infused in their students, whereby the worthiness of something, or the worthiness of the relevance of a particular subject matter is because of its particularity. And so she gives the example of how many times have you heard a student, when they're motivating for why they did a particular subject, said, I chose this because it was unique and interesting, and stressing the particular features of the particular subject matter that they chose to engage with. So something is only unique because of this, of its particularity and individual nature. So the point being that there's other possible explanations for the fusion of self and suffering. It doesn't have to be narcissism. Because, and I think it's important to make that point, because when we think about narcissism, is it a good thing? No, it's not something to be particularly valued. Okay. My own thinking through this is that I kind of saw an appeal in black pain. And I don't think, so this is a different reason why I think we should dismiss Mbembe's claim that black pain falls into the tragedy of narcissism. And that's because I think black pain is an indication of freedom. Now, allow me to work through this logic. In political philosophy traditions, there's a distinction made between negative freedom and positive freedom. Negative freedom is the absence of external impediments. So you're free as long as you're not in chains, for example, with chains being an example of an external impediment. But positive freedom is an exercise concept. It necessarily involves action. So positive freedom is considered as self-mastery. Am I the master of my actions? Now, I think that black pain, right, and the sentiments that come attached to it is surprisingly a manifestation of positive freedom. Why do I say surprisingly? Well, part of the ways in which positive freedom has been articulated is that what it means to be free from a positive sense is for your higher rational faculties to impose their will on your base desires, your feelings and emotions. So what it means to be free is to not listen to your emotions. But then in the context that we find ourselves in, we notice that black people have been told how they must feel about particular things. And initially, therefore, it seemed like positive freedom was telling us that emotions could never be a site of freedom. But now we're actually seeing a critique of this idea of positive freedom, whereby asserting your right to feel the way you feel currently is an assertion of freedom, particularly within a context where you've always been told, no, you must be rational, don't get angry, let's discuss, remember, let's negotiate and stuff like that. So I actually think that the rhetoric of black pain has appeal because it's a demonstration of freedom. But what I was uncomfortable with were the implications of exclusivity. And of course, this could be, and it's also something that Bembe alludes to when he says that personal feelings now suffice. There is no need to mount a proper argument. Not only wounds and injuries can't they be shared, their interpretation cannot be challenged by any known rational discourse. Why? Because it is alleged, black experience transcends human vocabulary to the point where it cannot be named. Now, there was a particular trend in the moment when, I'm basing this on experiences on the UCT campus, where all of a sudden, well, not all of a sudden, but it's been building up, white people are no longer seen as legitimate voices in discussions around transformation. So it wouldn't be uncommon to find a particular gathering and a white person stands up to talk, and then someone just gets enraged and says, look, this is precisely the sort of thing that we are fighting against. So white people are, and I think that this was alienating. Roseman's Fall showing itself to have an alienating force. Why do I say this? Well, it goes back to my understanding of Hegel and alienation being, so a classic hallmark of alienation is one-sidedness. Remember, I made the distinction between an objective existence and a subjective existence. And when you focus on one too strongly, you're alienated. So I think that this represented a moment in which, at least through that experience, Roseman's Fall is emphasizing its subjectivity, it's imposing itself too strongly on the world. So it's overimposing its subjective existence. Why am I saying it? Because it's imposing its will on the other. You can't talk anymore. And that is part of what it means to be free, to be able to impose your will on something. And to be able to, so when nature, for example, presents you with obstacles, and you relinquish this determinate existence by imposing your will on it. If nature provides you with a desire, you impose your will on that desire by destroying objects. You consume the objects. And it feels good when you do it, but you have to keep doing it over again. Okay. So I see this as characteristics of one-sidedness because it is seeking recognition from the other, from white people, but it's not necessarily willing to grant them the same recognition. So it's pursuing one-sided recognition. And what have we said about one-sidedness? That's a hallmark of alienation. To the extent that you're alienating others, you're also alienating yourself because others and the world are just mediums for self-expression. So to alienate others is to alienate yourself as well. So I maintain in this essay that the pursuit of one-sided recognition excludes the other. As such, it alienates, well, I've already said that, but the self, and the reason why it's one-sided is because it fails to recognize that the self is made at the point of encounter with an other. There is no self that is limited to itself. For Hegel, an unalienated relation between subjects entails mutual recognition. And my interpretation of seeing white people as illegitimate voices is that this does not amount to mutual recognition. Perhaps this is an incorrect reading. Now, this point, this seeing white people as illegitimate voices, I think was defended by appealing to Steve Biko, and as part of the tenets of a commitment towards black consciousness. So true liberation needs black people to kind of dig deep into themselves and free themselves from the inferiority complexes that are attached to the black identity. And subsequently, because white people cannot, because they don't live those inferiority complexes, they can never fully understand them, and so they can never really partake in the liberation that is necessary. But I don't think that we need to read that and move to the conclusion that white people are not illegitimate voices. I think we can read that and understand Biko as saying that because we have lived different experiences in terms of oppression and injustice and privilege, we cannot approach it from the same way. We cannot have the same kind of ideas about it. We cannot make the same contributions. But we can, the point is that each party has a different role to play. The role of the black student is to check the cause of this inferiority complex, to understand why it is that he's living this determinate existence. But the kind of conversation that the white person must have is that he must recognize himself as complicit through his privilege in the experiences that are deemed racist. So the point that I'm making is that we often think that racism affects only black people. I think Biko is making the further point that white people need to check what racism has done to them as well, of course, by investigating their privilege. So it's not that both of them cannot talk about the commitments of transformation, that they can only approach it in two fundamentally different ways. White people must check their privilege and what their privilege has done to them, how it's fundamentally destroyed their sense of humanity. So it's not like they can contribute anything meaningful to discussions around transformation. So I've just made the claim that RMF operated in a dialectical fashion. In challenging alienation, it proceeded to be itself an alienating force. One way in which RMF might respond to me is to say something like, well, the black paying rhetoric is preparing the ground for mutual recognition that I'm calling for. How is it doing this? Well, let's look at the reaction of white students. They started a movement to interrogate their privilege, and I think they called it disrupting whiteness. So it seemed for a while that both groups, why do I interpret this as preparing the grounds for mutual recognition? Well, both groups recognize that by virtue of the experiences they've had, they've been compromised in their possibility for having a kind of a relationship of mutual recognition with one another. So what they do is they take themselves out of these relationships and fundamentally interrogate themselves with the purpose of re-entering a relationship as changed and transformed people that allows for the possibilities of mutual recognition. So if it is the case that people do come back, if both parties do come back and see one another as having meaningful to contribute to discussions around transformation, that's fine. Roads Must Fall would have overcome this contradiction. If they don't, they are still stuck in that contradiction of seeking recognition without wanting to grant recognition to the other. So think about it. It sounds abstract, but if I seek recognition from you, but I don't want to grant you recognition, that's inevitably going to put us in conflict, right? So if failure to resolve this contradiction, failure to see this, to transcend the logic of exclusivity in terms of transforming ourselves to bring ourselves back into relation, if we fail to do this, if we fail to see that that's the way forward, then the only kind of outcome, to remain stuck at the level of I seek recognition from you without wanting to grant it to the other, is to be preparing the grounds for conflict. And maybe that's the outcome that people feel would truly resolve the contradictions of racism. I don't know. But I'm guessing that this view might be appealing to people of a more pacifist disposition. Okay. There is another counterpoint that Bembe might point out to this case. So I think I've criticized the exclusivity, but I've given a rationale for it. So my response to that, I think the exclusivity of Roads Must Fall has the potential to nonetheless prepare the grounds for mutual recognition, as I'm calling for, based on what we've seen happen in terms of movements like disrupting whiteness, also checking their privilege. So why is it important when Dembe says things like, we are more than our suffering? And so one subject could ultimately transcend his or her suffering. I am my pain is thus a self-imposed limit that denies to the subject the range of other things that he is or could be. What is the beginning of a reclaimed subjectivity? at the same time dialectically manifests as one's objectification as a suffering thing. So in being free to assert that, look, I have a right to feel the way I do because of the legacy of institutional racism, I am declaring myself to be free. But at the same time, in dialectically reducing myself as a suffering thing. I am an object that has a determinate existence as a suffering thing. I think it's quite easy for RMF to respond to this. It suffices to just say something like that the assertion of black pain only stresses pain as a major experience of a black person without necessarily negating the range of possibilities that one is or one could be. So it just suffices to say that, look, I recognize that there are other things I am as a person, I am as an individual, but pain as caused by institutional racism is a dominant part of my existence. It's not the only part, but a dominant part of my existence. Ultimately, when I wrote this paper, I was trying too hard not to judge myself. So I would often put someone like a shield as a proxy for me. And you'll see this in this. So one counter-argument you might say is that this essay relies too heavily on Achille Mbembe's views on RMF. This is important as it may, for an RMF insider, represent the views of someone too far away from the movement to see the subtleties and nuances of where and when mutual recognition might take place. So, and this is a criticism that I cannot refute. If it is true that I need a certain level of intimacy with RMF to be able to understand the subtleties of mutual recognition, then I would be the first to recognize that I am not as intimate with the movement as is otherwise possible. So I can't possibly see these things. So that is one criticism that I am unable to refute. Maybe it takes a certain level of connection and intimacy and physical involvement with the movement itself to be actually, to see the kinds of things that I think are otherwise absent. So it's not so much that the movement is criticizing what I'm calling for, like mutual recognition. It's just I'm not close enough to see when and where it's actually happening. Okay. The final part of my presentation goes back to this idea of a positive account of alienation. Alienation as simultaneously entailing self-loss and presenting the individual with an opportunity for self-discovery. And this self-discovery is merely just an opportunity to re-alter, to change our understandings of ourselves and others based on our experiences confronting alienation. So the question I ask is, how should we proceed with changing our understanding of ourselves and the world once we've confronted alienation, once we've confronted the experience of injustice? The argument I want to put forth is based on the notion of intersectionality. And if I'm not mistaken, intersectionality offers the claim that the experiences, identity-based privileges and oppressions are not experienced in an additive manner. So you don't experience discrimination as a black person, then as a woman, then as a homosexual or whatever. In any different moment, we experience life through a multiplicity of identities. Meaning that rather than an additive level of oppressions, we have a matrix of oppressions, whereby different oppressions intersect. Right? The experiences of injustices, sometimes you can find yourself privileged, sometimes you can find yourself underprivileged, despite the fact that you hold identities that are both amenable to the logic of oppression and privilege. So, in other words, I'm not simply a black man. In any particular moment, I'm a black middle class, heterosexual, foreign national, and the list keeps going on with this range of identities that I am. And because these identities intersect, there's a hierarchy of privileges and oppressions that I have access to. I think that the reality of intersectionality is important because it inevitably leads to the conclusion that we are simultaneously oppressors and oppressed. And what I mean by this is that in the same way as a black male student can make the charge that he is oppressed by white supremacy, he must also at the same time realize his complicity with structures of oppression, like patriarchy. I'm not saying that only black people subscribe to patriarchy. This is just an example for the purposes of the claim that I'm willing to advance. The claim being that we are all simultaneously oppressed and oppressors. Meaning that liberation, or at least agitations for liberation, must be horizontal. Liberation is not complete if not liberation for all. Why do I say this? Because any sort of transformation gains can be hijacked by charges of hypocrisy. If the Rhodes statue fell, next thing people are going to ask you, when is patriarchy going to fall? If patriarchy doesn't fall, it all of a sudden trivializes the gains that you've made. All of a sudden, it's stained, and its transformation becomes itself stained in structures of oppression that themselves continue to endure. Now, I do think that transformation movements have recognized this, and that's why I don't think of myself to be saying something new. That's why immediately after the Rhodes statue fell, they moved on to the next agenda. And I think in terms of chronology, that was outsourcing must fall and fees must fall. The movement transcended to a class to deal with class-based oppressions. And I think that's good in as much as it recognizes that, look, and you would find that there would be black middle-class students who would, for example, be criticizing white supremacy, but who nonetheless recognize that vis-a-vis a domestic worker or a campus worker at UCT in relation to the normative capitalist paradigm in which they operate, they are oppressors as well. And that's why they're arguing to transform relations in that particular way. So, I think hypocrisy is, I think we shouldn't undervalue the importance of hypocrisy. You just have to look at the UN to see whether or not, just look at the South American countries when an American president comes there and makes a point about injustice. I mean, people obviously, what right do you have to speak about this issue? You are yourself complicit in these very things, which is a damaging critique, because we are the sort of people that, although we can recognize that an action is good or an action is bad, it's also of great importance who is saying these things. And so the quest for legitimacy is as important as the things that are objectively right or wrong in terms of addressing legacies of injustice and privilege. So we should alter our understandings of ourselves, the world, and those in it, is to confront, or is to understand injustice and privilege from an intersectional point of view. So, in as much as alienation provides us, entails self-loss, the opportunity for self-discovery, what we should discover at the end of it all, the claim that they're making, the positive account of alienation, is to see and recognize that we are all simultaneously oppressors and oppressed, and to also recognize the obligations that come with this realization. And the obligations that come with this realization I have termed as total liberation, horizontal liberation across the board, liberation of everyone and not just one particular group of the disaffected. Otherwise, transformation gains can be hijacked by hypocrisy. Thank you.